to make sure that we recognize this work and learn what we can draw from his ministry and his evangelism. We are asking ourselves, what are the lessons? If you look even at the self-sustaining congregations that are still there through the Assemblies of God churches, they don't go overseas begging for money to run their ministry, because she taught them to be self-reliant, taught women to use hands, and they use their hands to produce things that would be sold, and the money supported his ministry. And he was the first Southern African Black evangelist to build a 5,000-seater church. And we're talking of the 60s, 70s, a long time ago. But there are very few people who know the work that Mpofu did. He passed on in 1985. But up to now, this story hasn't been told enough. And yeah, briefly, we want to then commemorate him through this annual lecture. And some of the objectives, of course, is to celebrate the leadership that Mpofu provided and develop contextual leadership approaches to mission and evangelism, and also work towards archiving. We have conversations with the library here at the UP to archive some of his work. There are recordings that have been collected by one of the scholars who authored this book, and there will be an official ceremony to present all the material, the letters that he exchanged within his leadership structures, the recorded videos of some people and his relatives who are still alive. They will be collected and put together in the archives in the library, so that our students who are doing research can access those resources and very powerful concepts.
It would be nice to connect with your colleague as well. Maybe he can share a little bit about the book, some other time, or some review, maybe after the conference, because it's important that people, try and attend this conference. So you were saying we can attend it online. We don't have to actually go to Johannesburg.
We are hoping to do both face-to-face and hybrid. But given also I think the interest in the Back to God and Assemblies of God, there's a lot of people who are interested in that. So we do not think if we do it face-to-face, we will do justice, for example, to people who are in East London, where his ministry started, and in the Eastern Cape, and people who are in Zimbabwe and other parts of the world who were exposed to his ministry. So we are going to have a few people who can fit in the venue here, and then the rest will join us online. And the good thing is that whether you travel in person or you want to join online, it will be a free event. We are not charging for taking part in that lecture.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that.
Regarding the book is available online. There is an e-book as well. I will share the details with you after the interview.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. No, I really appreciate that, and looking forward to it myself. As somebody who's, like you were saying, planted so many churches, inspired so many people, and really impacted the kingdom of God. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that conference. So let's get into our discussion for today, sir, which we are going to be looking at the topic of apartheid, how it affected the church, and how the church affected apartheid. And so one of the questions that is generally asked by people is, what were some of the shortcomings of the church during apartheid? The church is supposed to be a beacon of hope in society, and the church is also not perfect at the same time. And so what were some of the shortcomings of the church during apartheid?
So thank you for that question. I'm aware that the scope of this interview is not very long, so I will not get into really explaining details about the apartheid situation at that time. And my assumption is that our audience would then locate themselves within that context, where there was this apartheid regime and the masses of Black people being oppressed and marginalized, and all the history that we know. And I would therefore assume that the context is clear to our audience, so that I get straight into responding to your question. Well, the shortcomings of the church, if we locate them within that context, we will remember that during the apartheid era, South Africa had the South African Council of Churches, which played a very significant role in supporting the struggle for liberation, but also in exposing and opposing apartheid. There is a number of documents that were crafted and inspired by the pastors working together through the South African Council of Churches. And through this effort and through the documents that they put together, they were working globally with ecumenical movements like the World Council of Churches. And one of the very important documents that I think is still very relevant for today was the Kairos document, where the Christian churches and the leadership pointed out some weaknesses or some challenges regarding the apartheid system, and they exposed it as a sin, to a point that the WCC acknowledged also that the apartheid was not in line with what God desired for his people. And therefore, this gave the momentum for the church to mobilize globally alongside the liberation fighters. But coming straight into your question, the shortcomings of the church. The first one that was very clear was the divisions within the church. Because when we're talking about the church, even in our time, it's still not clear who we're talking to, or who we're talking about when we say the church in South Africa, because as you know, we are a very diverse church. You want to talk about the mainline churches, you want to talk about the evangelicals, the Pentecostal, and sometimes even divisions within the same movements, like the Pentecostal. We're not talking about the same sort of church. There are different groups of Pentecostal movements, or even you're talking about the Presbyterians, for example. We are not a single church. We have the Presbyterian Church of Africa, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, the Uniting Presbyterian Church. So that posed to be a challenge, those divisions, because the church was not a monolithic entity, and there were divisions among various Christian denominations. So that confronting apartheid also posed to be a challenge when people were not divided. Were not united. And the second important challenge as well linked to that was the lack of a unified opposition to apartheid. Even within the SACC, which was formed in 1968 to oppose apartheid, there were differences in approaches and strategies among member churches. Remember also that some of the churches, when we talk about the churches at that time, there was also the influence of the Dutch Reformed churches as well, which in some way was also part of the apartheid movement, and at the same time trying to transform into a movement that can play a role in creating a new South Africa. So some leaders...
So before you move maybe from that point, is, a lot of people have picked up on there was, I guess, some theological basis for apartheid. Is there anything that you can touch on in terms of how the church actually viewed apartheid from, I'm not talking about the whole church, obviously, I guess, but I think the church that kind of lost its role in during apartheid, how did they sort of find a theological basis for apartheid?
Yeah, the Kairos document that I referred to had more to do with exposing apartheid as a heresy and calling for a united movement that will continue to challenge that. And that was used to mobilize the international community. And for example, the World Council of Churches had what was known as the Program to Combat Racism. And that program created a special fund to support churches and initiatives that were aimed at confronting racism. But it became a complex matter because, for example, when the program to combat racism was created at the World Council of Churches, one of the challenges that they had to grapple with, because this was funded by white churches who at that time were in some cases supporting the apartheid government, it became a divisive issue within the WCC itself to say, are we going to allow that our funds are used to support violence? And by violence, they meant when people were protesting against, apartheid, in some cases they would turn or resort to violence. But also added to that, there was an armed liberation movement, which was created to resist and to fight colonialism and apartheid. So that matter became a burning issue within the World Council of Churches when this program to combat racism and the funding was provided to say, is it justifiable for us as churches to be funding programs that have violence, programs that have to do with violence as means of addressing peace and reconciliation issues? But there was, of course, a need for the WCC to say, for as long as we agree that colonialism and apartheid are evil, and all people that are standing up against this need and deserve the support, part of that support will mean that there are financial resources made available. And so the WCC took a stance and they continued to make funds available even to the liberation movements like the ANC that had armed themselves to say we are going to fight racism. So you will understand, or you can imagine the kind of resistance that some people would face in trying to use the whole idea of violence to support church programs to combat racism. So it became a very divisive and controversial issue as well.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the church was so involved to a point where they even funded the liberation movement to some degree.
Absolutely. Through different ecumenical structures. But this was not coordinated in a way that involved the blessing of all the churches. As I've indicated, mostly white churches were skeptical about putting money towards fighting apartheid. They were using that as a justification to say, because there's violence that comes with fighting for liberation, we can't then be supporting financially such programs. But then those that were progressive, even within the church, went on to mobilize funds within the church structures and within the WCCSA to support the movement. But I want to maybe indicate that there was a clause, and it was clear with the WCC that the programs that they supported were identified. And although there was, of course, violence in the movements, but that was not for them the major issue. They had to identify the objectives of the program that the movement was pursuing, and then they would put funds. And here in South Africa, it became so divisive that even the apartheid government, looked at the SACC with suspicion. And some of the leaders of the SACC had to do some of these activities underground. They had to hide because the government at that time did not like what they were doing and mobilizing resources against the government.
And I heard also that the government, I'm not sure if it was the headquarters of the South African Council of Churches, that I don't know if they actually blew it up or they did something to their building, but during apartheid.
Yes. A lot of church leaders suffered, some of them actually violence. There's one of the prominent bishops here, Bishop, is in Durban, Story. Is it? No, is a Story, who started this program on dealing with trauma. He lost his hand. He's disabled because he was bombed. He received a letter bomb from the apartheid government at that time. And these were some of the few white bishops and white leaders who were taking sides with the oppressed. So they became a target, even if they were white, given the influence and the support that they were giving to the liberation movement. So they became a threat to the apartheid government, and some of them were bombed and they experienced violence as well.
Sure. And then on the political side, were there any Christian politicians that I guess would consider themselves a part of the church? I'm not talking about people like Desmond who were ministers, but maybe people who were politicians but who were openly Christian.
Yes, sure. I think people like Chikane and others, Bishop Story and others, Bishop Desmond Tutu and others, they were within the church, but also very vocal politically. And they did not hide their involvement in politics when it came to challenging the oppressive regime. And that is why some of them, were incarcerated, or some had to be, or to leave the country. But a lot of these activities within the church were done underground. Some church spaces would be open and people would gather as if they're just coming to pray. And within those church spaces, they also discuss political issues, the situation in South Africa, and they would open the space for the ANC. And if I'm not wrong, I think even the founding fathers, Olangalibale Dube, they were involved to a point that I think the establishment of the ANC, the meetings that led to the formation of the ANC in 1912 were happening in the churches. People would gather there for prayer, but then discuss political issues, because if you are coming to church, at least there was less scrutiny on why you are gathering. And they would worship, and then after that, spend some time then to strategize and discuss issues related to the political situation at that time.
So the church was quite close to the liberation of people, I guess, from 1912 right through to 94, which would lead me then to the next question is, why is it important for the church to have a voice in society, for the church to have some form of, I guess, way of communicating biblical truth and our biblical convictions to society and to the world, and to have some form of influence?
Yeah, one of the challenges that I think, or that I see with the church, especially at the moment, is some kind of fatigue especially when we are not experiencing a lot of violence. We tend to resort to our own little spaces of our faith communities and do business as usual.